It's not as if you rebel and don't have a plan. You still have to pay the rent. You still have to exist. But the rebellion comes in knowing absolutely what you want. And I think a lot of people don't know what they want. And that makes the decision-making very difficult.
This is A Joyful Rebellion, the podcast that explores that moment you realize the life and success you worked so hard to create didn't come with all the fulfillment you thought it would. I'm your host, James Walters, and I want you to be the author of your own story. Each week, I connect with people who inspire bold answers to the question, what do I do now to create a life I love? If you're ready to start answering that question for yourself, you're in the right place. So let's start a joyful rebellion. What does it look like to live life on your own terms, especially when the world expects something totally different from you? My guest today is Cinda Gault, a novelist and lifelong feminist whose work centers on women who refuse to stay small. Before writing fiction, she helped start a crisis support center for women, worked in a men's prison, and built a career exploring power, autonomy, and choice. In this conversation, we talk about her path into writing, why she's drawn to bold female characters, and how fiction can bring history and identity back to life. If you've ever felt the pull to live bigger and more on your own terms, this one's for you. Cinda Gault, thank you so much for being here on A Joyful Rebellion today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, indeed, because you have written some really interesting stories, and the reason I wanted to talk with you is because you are interested in writing stories about women who are having adventures. Mm-hmm. Not quite rebellions maybe, but maybe a little bit of that too. But I thought the top...
Yes, yeah? Definitely there are rebellions involved.
Okay, we love that. Let's talk about that because you've had a couple of different careers over the course of the last several decades. Take us back to when you decided you wanted to start writing books and you decided that your main protagonists are going to be women rebelling, having adventures.
I did not plan on becoming a writer. I always loved school and I loved reading and writing, but it didn't occur to me to be a writer. I always just followed my interests. And that brought me in the 1970s to, I was an undergrad at the University of Guelph at the time, and I found myself very interested in the second wave women's movement that was happening at the time. The I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, Helen Reddy kind of women's movement, which was very different then than it is now. And I, along with another group of women, started up a rape crisis center and a shelter for victims of domestic violence. And we did that as a university club and got together to just, at the very beginning, there was a lot of discovery during that decade about what could be done, what women could do, that sort of thing. So that's what I started to do. After I graduated, I became the first executive director of the Women in Crisis, which was the organization we started. It was my job to set up the shelter, which I did. And then when I finished that, I decided I had worked with victims and I'd like to go check out some perpetrators. So I became a prison guard at the men's prison that had a maximum security wing that housed inmates convicted of sexual assault or arson or just had mental or emotional problems. And I did that for 13 months. And then I went off and did my MA in criminology. I graduated, got the job of my dreams, being a director of a social service agency, and there came my joyful rebellion because I hated it. And I discovered about myself, I do not like managing people. I don't like it being my job to get other people to do their jobs. It seems like kind of the role of a mummy, and adults aren't cute enough to warrant a mummy. So that was my big navel gaze at the time. Having any kind of career requires you to put up with a lot and invest a lot. And I wanted to make sure that whatever it was I chose to do, it was going to be worth whatever I had to do for it. And that's when I decided that writing stories was the most deeply meaningful thing that I could do. But any joyful rebellion requires the rent to be paid. So I had to make money doing it. And that's when I learned how to write a romance. I had never read one at the time, but they seemed to be what was selling at the time. And so I began consuming dozens of them to try to figure out how they worked. And they're challenging little suckers to write, I've got to tell you. It seems like it's the easiest thing in the world to talk about love, but you can get them together quite easily on the first page, but you have to keep them arguing about something for 350 pages without one of them looking like an idiot. So I set my story in Guelph because I was told that Americans find Canadian locales exotic. Now tell me, do they?
Oh, yes, sometimes, especially if they seem like they would be hard to pronounce.
Okay, well, Guelph, when you look at how it's spelled, might look a little odd, but it's easy enough to pronounce. Anyway, so I knew Guelph, so I said it there. And I had my protagonist was a youth bureau police officer, and the hero owned a group home. And so what I decided that they would argue about was how to bring up children. And they each had good points on their side, but they disagreed with each other. And one day she had to place a juvenile, and he was the only one who had a bed open. And so that's what brought them together. And that I published as a Harlequin super romance in 1988 on a manual typewriter. There were no cell phones, there were no computers, there were no anything. Last year, my current publisher said that she wanted to publish it again. So I needed to get my rights back, which Harlequin has a generous rights reversion program, so that was no problem. But I had to go and revise the romance, and it was very interesting that I had to change a lot of technology. I had phone booths and landlines and all that. But it was interesting because at the romance part of the story held. I didn't have to do much with that. So it's nice to think that there's some things about being human that don't change all that much, even though technology does. So I decided I would make three big decisions, and was to become a writer, and writing the Harlequin was part and parcel of making that practical. The other one was to go back to school because I had gone through in psychology and criminology, but writing fiction is a very different way to write. And I wanted to know what my tradition was that I was going into. So I went back and did another MA and caught fire with that and went on to do a PhD in English. And I focused on Canadian women writers who came to writing prominence between the years 1965 to 1980. I don't expect you to know Canadian history, but during that time, we had Pierre Trudeau as our prime minister. And it was a very feel good about being Canadian time in Canadian history. He just seemed to make being Canadian an interesting thing, and people were exploring the country. That was back at the time that the States was going through the sort of student movement time, and so were we. You had bigger investment because you had the Vietnam War, and we didn't. But it became a lot of the issues that Canadians talked about at the time arose from Canadian nationalism and second wave feminism. The two of those social movements were very connected to each other because they both talked about autonomy. And so, Canadians, the talk was we're going to bring the Constitution home so we can make our own decisions about ourselves. And that's exactly what women were saying at the time with reproductive autonomy, sexual autonomy, that sort of thing. So they were very intertwined and very exciting for Canadians to talk about. And then the third big decision I made was have my babies. And I had two boys that were 2 and 5 when I went back to grad school. So we all went to school together as they were growing up. And if you ever want to make somebody really miserable, suggest they do that. And then we all sort of grew up at the same time. They mercifully went off to university, and I had more time to be able to write. I taught from then on. Then I started writing the 3 historical fiction novels that you would have read about.
When you write historical fiction, it's a completely different layer over top of just writing the fiction. So it's kind of like you mentioned with your first romance novel when you had to go back and you had to change all of the technology, and the main storyline kind of held, but all of the things you described and the things that the people interacted with would have been pretty different. But when it comes to writing historical fiction, and I know you've done several wildly different time periods.
Yes.
What's something you have to really think about up front when you're trying to write for that period for people who are living and immersed in that period so that you can immerse the reader?
Well,
in that time?
one thing that holds those three novels together is that they're all set in a Canadian setting, and I'm a Canadianist. That's in my PhD, that's what my work was. So it's not unfamiliar to me. And it's funny how you just have very different sparks that begin a different story. And the first two, being historical in the 19th century, I had to learn about those worlds through research. And some things come down through history intact and some things don't. You can have the facts come down, but those more human, ephemeral aspects of a person's life, they don't come down over time. So that's the sort of the role of a fiction writer, is to breathe that life back into a character. But the third one I lived through. I set it in the 1970s, and so I lived through those times. So I didn't have to do any research on that. The challenge was, it will probably be the most autobiographic in spirit book that I ever write. So because I lived through it, it's like you process the history that you're living through. And the challenge is to figure out how to make a story out of a life, because a life isn't a story. It's a and then, and then, and then, and then. And a story has a definite structure to it. So that became more of a challenge, which is why I didn't write that book first, because I needed, to hone my chops as a writer before I could do that. But with the first two, especially with the one that was called A Small Compass, and I learned about this protagonist whose name was Isabel Gunn, and in 1806 she cut her hair and disguised herself as a man in Orkney, Scotland, and got hired onto Hudson's Bay Company ship and came over to Canada to work in the fur trade as a man. And she managed that for 18 months until she was outed by having a baby on the hearth of a fur trading post in Pembina, which was in Canada then, but it's in North Dakota now. And when I discovered her existence, I had been reading a fur trader's journal, and there was a little asterisk, and down at the bottom of the page there was a footnote saying, "An extraordinary thing happened tonight. An Orkney lad had a baby on the hearth of," and I thought, oh my God, there's a story that's just dying to be told. And I went out to find out who she was, and I realized another writer had beaten me to the punch and written a novel about it. And I read the novel, and I was shocked at how differently that writer saw these facts compared to how I envisioned them. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write my own version. But, nobody knows Isabel Gunn. Nobody knows what she was like. If you think of your great-great-great-grandparents, what do you know about them? The things that do travel down through history is you'd know when they were born, when they got married, when they had kids, when they died. That's pretty much what we know. And think about what your great-great-great-grandkids would know about you. They don't know your hopes and your dreams and your disappointments and your secrets and all of those sorts of things, or even the sound of your voice or the things that don't travel. It's an interesting idea. I have two granddaughters now. They're 2.5, coming up to 3. And they are going to have the most recorded lives because every day they have video taken of them. So much more will translate through history in the future. But the things that make you who you are and make sense of who you are, meaning your interior life, that's only if you choose to share it. So I still had to figure out what Isabel Gunn would have been like, her motivations, all those sorts of things, to figure out what her story was as she lived it through.
That's fascinating. So there was really a person named Isabel Gunn.
Yeah.
And the first part of the story apparently really happened, and then you got inspired by her story, or the little bit that you could tease out of that journal, and then you filled in the blanks.
Well, she didn't have a journal, but I was able to get primary research on her. One good thing about the Hudson's Bay Company, the Brits were very good at keeping records. So there is in Winnipeg, Manitoba, there is an entire building that is the Hudson's Bay Company archives. Because at the Hudson's Bay fur trading posts, each post was called a factory, and the man in charge was called the factor. And part of what he did was he kept a journal about everything that happened at that post. And so I went to the archives, and you need to go in and put special gloves on and have a special pencil, and you can't just go rifling through their stacks. You have to ask them for what you're looking for. And I asked for the journal of that time period for Fort Albany, where I knew she was, because I wanted to know where she was when she got pregnant. I knew when she had the baby, so counting back the 9 months, I wanted to know to tell the story where that would have happened so I could envision it. So that was a treasure trove of detail because I knew everything she did every day. You know, they would go out hunting. I knew how many partridges they brought back. I knew when they went paddling on the rivers, taking provisions to different fur trading posts, I knew what they were taking. I know how many days they were away. I knew all the people she was with when she went. So that was fantastic. And also, I had the captain's manifest for the ship that took her from Stromness, Scotland, over to Fort Albany and Hudson's Bay. So I knew the weather every day. I knew what the employees were doing to work on the ship, you know, when they were tarring something or when they were making rope or whatever it was they were doing. It was fantastic to have that kind of detail as far as the facts that I could deal with. And then I had to make her up in the kind of crevices between the cracks. But along the way, when I was researching for that, I discovered the existence of another woman. And her name was Marie-Anne Gaboury. Same time, she was from Masconoget, Quebec, a little farming village. And apparently she was drop dead gorgeous and had proposals from everybody in the village, but she had decided she was not going to be a farmer's wife. Her mother had been one, and her father died in a farming accident, and her mother remarried a merchant in the village who had a furniture store. And so the mother got herself off the farm, and Marie-Anne decided, I'm not going back there. That's too hard a life. So she just was 26 and unmarried, and she was just refusing everything. And then into town blows a Coeur de Bois, who is a adventurer from out west. I envision him as having the fringed, sexy leather jacket. And he blows into town. He's got all kinds of stories of adventure from out west. And they fall madly in love. They get married really quickly before he realizes he has to go back out west, which he hadn't been planning to do. And she said, well, you take me with you or you don't ever see me again. And so she became the first passenger in a voyageur canoe being paddled out west, 1,800 miles out west. And what really was a day I remember was the day I discovered that those two women were in Pembina. Isabel was at the Hudson's Bay Company post on one side of the teeny tiny Pembina River, and Marie-Anne Gaboury was on the other side at the Northwest Company post because her husband worked for them. And they had their babies a week apart from each other, that close to each other, and there's no record of them ever having met. So I was just going to write a story about Isabel Gunn up to that point. And when I learned about Marie-Anne, I had a new structure for the story where they had they had different journeys to get to the same place at the same time in the same condition. And we don't know if they met in life, but in my story, they meet and hijinks ensue, as they say in the business.
Hijinks ensues. I like it. So when did you go from the romance novels that you said were going to pay the bills to things that you were much more maybe interested in with the historical novels?
Well, I wrote one romance. That was it. And then I went back into academe. So there were many years of writing essays and that sort of thing. So that when I graduated, I defended my doctorate and became a lecturer. I had just finished two huge projects, being my academic work and my kids. And they both came off my shoulders around the same time. And I just felt like I wanted to be free. I wanted to be galloping over the prairies with the wind in my hair, just free for the first time in a very long time. So I decided that I would research the Jesse James gang because they got to ride horses and they could do whatever they wanted. So I thought, that sounds like fun. I'm just going to go do that. And as I was researching them, I was realizing how close Canadian and American history were at that time, unfolding just on either side of the border, with the Jesse James hijinks going on the south, and we had the Louis Riel rebellion in the north. So that's where, and they weren't very far away from each other. And so that was 1885 for both of them. So I decided in my first one, This Godforsaken Place, I would set my novel at that time. That's why that time period is what it is in that novel. And there were two historical figures who I found intriguing from that time that I knew I wanted to incorporate into the story. And one was Annie Oakley, because she was the Wayne Gretzky of her time with a rifle instead of a hockey stick. She was just so much better than anybody else was at the time. I suspect she was born with some kind of perceptual ability that she could just do something nobody else could do that well. And she was a woman in a man's world at the top of the game. And she was not embraced by any feminist movement, any women's movement at the time, because she didn't have the appropriate opinions for that. And then the other one was Gabriel Dumont, and he was Louis Riel's right-hand general. And I found him interesting because he was apparently a brilliant tactician, and he wanted to do things, and Louis Riel would say to him, no, God doesn't want you to do that. And he would stand back and not do it, which seemed an odd thing for a military person to do. You'd think that they would be more hard line. But so he was basically fighting a rebellion with one hand tied behind his back. If he were allowed to do some of the things he wanted to do, I suspect it would have been a very different course of history. So anyway, I knew I wanted to incorporate them to a story where I had a fictional protagonist. Her name was Abigail, 22 years old in Britain. And she was at her mother's deathbed when her mother was having regrets and saying, I lived a very small compass, which is where I got the title for my next book. I never went beyond my garden gate, and who knows what I could have done if I had been a little braver and, gone farther afield. So Abigail takes this to heart, and after her mother dies, she and her father go across the Atlantic Ocean to northwestern Ontario to teach. And it's a place called Wabigoon that I know about because it's where my husband's from. And it was the middle of nowhere then, and it's still the middle of nowhere now, but I know the landscape. So she goes with her father to teach, but shortly after they get there, he falls ill with consumption. So she's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be stranded here by myself with the shopkeeper spending way too much attention on her than she wanted. So she decides to buy a rifle just to be able to have some kind of action and do something. So she's out in her Rocky Back 40 practicing when she stumbles across a wounded Jesse James gang character. And she's leaning over trying to find out who he is. When she gets shot from behind, she wheels around with her rifle and she shoots and kills the Pinkerton cop who was tracking him. So she's got a very big problem on her hands. And this is what launches her on her epic journey from there. And I take her out to Winnipeg, down through Manitoba, into the States. And the day I discovered that Gabrielle Dumont and Annie Oakley were actually working for the Bill Cody Wild West show in New York in a certain year, I had a place I wanted to send her. So they all meet up there and hijinks ensue.
That's great. Do you have a favorite time period that you like to write about out of all of them that you've done so far?
It's not the time period so much. As you mentioned earlier, I have a lot of respect for women who just insist on having a meaningful life. That it doesn't matter what anybody's telling them they're supposed to do. It doesn't matter what the obstacles are to them. That they recognize that I have this life. What are the chances that you make it onto this planet? You've won a lottery if you get here at all, no matter what the circumstances are when you get here. And they just decided with obvious great determination that they were going to do what was important to them no matter what. And I find that kind of a story an interesting one. And so no matter the time period, the interesting part is watching how these women figure that out. And how they do live their life through to accomplish what is interesting and fascinating and compelling and worth it to them. And so all of my female protagonists are that kind of a personality.
Do you get the feedback from some of your readers that they found it refreshing that they could read a story that took them back in time, but also saw women kicking butt at the same time?
Yeah. I'm an old-fashioned feminist because back when we were very excited about the issues of the day, our attitude was just get out of my way, and let me do what I want to do. You don't need to take care of me. You don't need to protect me. You don't need to do any of those things. Just don't tell me that I can't have this job or that job, or I can't get a bank loan, or I can't do this, that, or the other. And I find that in recent years, there has been a very big emphasis on victims. And even though I have worked with victims in the past, there's a lot of bravery among people who have had to deal with hardship. And I have respect for the strength that people show. I mean, it's not just women who have experienced difficulty. Everybody does. It's very human to experience obstacles. Now, it might be that the nature of the obstacles change depending on the time that you were born, and, men and women have had different challenges. But there's just something really wonderfully human about not accepting that and fighting just because you're alive, and not just to survive, but to do something more than that, to do something that feels meaningful to you. And and I see it's very much the role of fiction to feed that appetite that people have, because fiction makes you feel like being a human being matters. That we're here and it is something important we're doing. Your life is important even if you're going to die. And, we're the only species who knows that. What we're doing is valuable and important no matter what happens to it. So it really is, the journey is how you are going to understand yourself, how you manage that. And I like those kinds of stories. I wouldn't want to write a story where everything was doomed.
That's a good point, because I had someone on the show a few weeks back, and her thing was she wanted to write a book that was kind of the answer to all of the dystopian novels that are out right now. So her character has some powers. It's not a fantasy, but her character has some powers that allow her to basically engage with nature, communicate with the rocks, the trees, animals, whatever's going on, and to understand what's going on literally in the world around her.
Uh-huh.
And it was a charming story that had a great ending, and not a great ending in the way that, oh, I've got to read the next one. It was more like, okay, everything returned to peace. And that's the kind of book she wanted to put out, because she has seen and read so many that were despair and just a dystopian, polish on the world, I guess. It's really cool when you can decide what message you want to put out in the world, and then you can have fun with it.
Yeah.
Just like you did.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always a happy ending or that anybody ever achieves peace. I mean, back in the 80s, as I hear now, people talk about having a balanced life. Well, yeah. I've never had one. I've never figured, and I don't even know that I would want to have one, to tell you the truth, because I like the excitement of, and excitement is the other side of a coin of fear, So to have a peaceful, balanced life sounds pretty boring to me, because I will push it. If anything seems too calm, it's time for me to take on some new challenge to see if I can do it or not. So it's not as if Isabel Gunn lived happily ever after. She didn't have a disastrous life, but it's not as if she had some big triumph. That she got what she wanted is what happened. And that is the important thing. And I think going back to your idea of a joyful rebellion, you have to be brutally honest with yourself if you're going to do that, about what it is you really want. Because it's not as if you rebel and don't have a plan. You still have to pay the rent. You still have to exist. But the rebellion comes in knowing absolutely what you want. And I think a lot of people don't know what they want. And that makes the decision-making very difficult. And not everybody has to rebel with their job. You don't have to always quit your job to have a rebellion. I have a friend whose version of it was she retired early as soon as she could. She calls herself a 2-star girl, that she doesn't need a 5-star life. And she retired at 60 and she bought herself an RV. And she has been roaming around like a gypsy ever since. And she loves it. And this is more than 10 years later. And she's still doing it. And it's just what gets her up every day. She absolutely loves it. So she worked her career so that she could be in a position that she could do this. But she knew what would make her happy. And I think that's the trick to it all, is to be so honest with yourself about what kind of a life you could live happily And then it becomes more or less mechanical, especially now. I mean, we have more freedom and sort of the necessities of life now than any other humans at any other time in history. We are very lucky to be in the time and place that we are. So what's standing in our way would just be our own confusion.
Yeah. When it comes to writing about the 70s, and you probably were thinking about what you were specifically doing in those days, what the days were like, you lived through them. Did that make it a lot easier, or did it make it a little more difficult to decide which details you were going to talk about in the stories? Because you lived it, so you could pour on all the level of detail, or you could choose to kind of dial it back as needed. What were some of the challenges, but also some of the things that made writing about that time period so much more, well, I don't know that it was more fun, but I'm curious to know what made it a lot of fun, but also made it challenging.
Yes, I would say it does make it more challenging because as a writer, a lot of what you do is selection. Your story could go in a bunch of different directions, just taking it at the plot level. And then the details that you remember, you're flooded with them because you lived through them. But the biggest challenge was to make the structure of a story. There's got to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. But after, one of the good things about having it so far in the past is that the things that you remember are the important things. You know, the things that rise to the surface that you remember. It's funny how memory is, because you can remember some singular little detail from when you were 18, and here you are still remembering it. And then if someone said to you, oh yeah, do you remember when we did such and such? You know, we went on this trip or we did that and the other. No, I don't remember any of that. But you can remember what color somebody's shirt was at the time. So that is an interesting thing just in and of itself. Why do we remember the details that we remember, even before putting that together in a story? But the backdrop of the story, being a coming-of-age book, the backdrop was the excitement of the times. They were tumultuous times. In Canada, it was very similar to the American experience, of course, but we had a Divorce Act that in 1968 made it a lot easier for people to get divorces. And boy, there must have been a lot of unhappy people who wanted divorces because the divorce rate skyrocketed all through the 70s. So that meant you had a lot of family turmoil. You had a lot of disruption. You had a lot of families breaking up at the time. And at the same time, you had the excitement of changing times, especially for women. At that time, you had, I don't expect you to know this either, Henry Morgentaler was a doctor in Canada who basically single-handedly brought the nation to its knees about the abortion law, and got the abortion law knocked down so that Canada still is the only Western country. We do not have an abortion law. We do not have one. It was in our criminal code from the 1800s, and we just don't have one now because it was knocked down, and in order to put another one in place, you'd have to have consensus that you'll never get on this kind of issue. So it actually works in favor of just keeping things without a law. So that was all going on, which was very exciting for female autonomy. And then you had the pill became something. So you had the whole sexual revolution where women were in charge of themselves. They were going to school, post-secondary education in droves. They were going into jobs like being a prison guard in a men's prison that you wouldn't have been able to do before. So there was an excitement. There was a turmoil and there was an excitement to it as well. And so this is the milieu that the protagonist comes of age in. And of course, she does the thing that's the worst thing that she could do because you need terrible trouble for a story. And she chooses the long-haired hippie with no job that everybody hates.
Of course she does.
And so she has to figure out who's she going to listen to, who she's not going to listen to. You know, is she going to make herself vulnerable by leaving home? What she could just be this reckless teenager, or she could be somebody who's actually thinking for herself. Any of these things are possible. So the story could go in a number of different directions. I mean, this could be a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing, that because of the interference of friends and family, you have a true love that never gets the chance to see the light of day. It's not that. You could have a really naturalist kind of story where everybody's just ruined and wrecked and unhappy. At the end, it's not that either. What it is a story that tracks the protagonist through the negotiation of these kinds of times, and that there are dangers and there are risks and there are rewards of her kind of steering her own ship. And so you get a certain understanding of yourself from doing that. She does leave home, so she is not brought up by anyone. And, women of that age, I would say probably across the centuries, those are the ones everybody wants to control, because up until the 70s, they get pregnant and that was the disaster, or was a ruined woman, or all that sort of thing. But there's a little conversation in this one where she meets somebody who she loves, and the father expresses concern that if he doesn't marry her, that she'll be a ruined woman. And he says, "Oh, she was ruined when I got her." So, the idea of how you're going to be defined and how you're willing to be defined it seemed all newly possible during those years. And of course, then there was the music, and each of my chapters is the title of one of the songs, of a song from the 70s that was thematically resonant.
All right.
I mean, there was fun in it, but there's also the challenge of what you put in, what you leave out, and what the overall effect you want, how you get that.
Do you have readers who contact you and say, "Oh my gosh, I read this," and what's their reaction? But is there a common reaction? Someone reads it and they say, "This was such a great story because," and what do they fill in the blank with?
There are two different audiences for it, and so I get different reactions. There is the audience that is my generation. They will say it was a trip down memory lane, and they really enjoyed it for that. Because there are many things within a generation that you don't have to say to each other. You just all remember. Even the ambiance of the time. You kind of laugh at the same things, you roll your eyes at the same things, you wore the same things, ate the same things. It's something that is kind of fun just to go back and remember it. I do speaking engagements with different groups, and one of them is they're retired people. And I went and did a presentation on A Small Compass. So I was telling them all about Isabel Gunn and blah, blah, blah. And I brought a whole bunch of those books thinking that that would be the book that they wanted. But then at the end, I tell them about what the other books, just very briefly, what the other books are about. I sold out all of everything I hoped for. And I said, "Why are you buying this book? Why aren't you buying The Small Compass, the one I was talking about?" And they said, "Well, I want to remember my youth. I want to remember my times. I want to remember what that was like." So that's one audience. And then there's another audience that's younger, and they have heard of the 70s. They don't know what it was like but they've heard probably boomer parents, or probably, maybe even grandparents by now, talk about the times. There are cultural sort of memes that they have inherited. Some of them, you kind of wonder where they got them. But I have been told by that age group that they romanticize the 70s in a way that is kind of surprising. But in another way, it isn't surprising because they were fairly innocent times in a lot of ways. Just that generation. It was pre-AIDS. It was pre a lot of the big bad things that happened in North America. Now, there was the Vietnam War, which was a big bad thing that was happening back then. It wasn't happening in Canada. So people who are Canadians who are interested in reading this story, they're not having to read about sons and brothers having to go off to war in that way. So it's just inherently a happier story. But I think the music had a lot to do with it, where people romanticize it. And it was a time of young people. Boomer generation was the biggest generation we've had. And all those people being young at the same time, that can't help but affect the society as a whole, which it did. So people seem to be kind of fascinated by it, even if they didn't live through it.
I blame Mamma Mia, the musical, for some of that, because I work with students, and a lot of the students are 19, 20, 21. And the other day, an ABBA song came on, and they were like, "Oh yeah, Mamma Mia," and I was like, "No,
No.
that's not from Mamma Mia." I mean, maybe they played it in Mamma Mia, but this is ABBA. It's a band
Yeah.
from 70s, 80s, and you just go learn some history.
Yeah.
And it was kind of funny because I guess that musical came about and it gets played, people love it, and it's a lot of that disco music, which
Yeah.
is so fun, but it's not Mamma Mia, it's ABBA.
I remember when our kids were kind of around the 10 to 12-ish age, in their Christmas stockings. In one, we put Abbey Road, a CD of Abbey Road, and in the other one, we put a Led Zeppelin one in. And they couldn't believe it. So
Oh, wow.
even though they were of a different generation and were used to, they were listening to Our Lady Peace and things at the time that weren't things that we would have listened to, but they still recognized the originality of the music that was being, I mean, rock and roll was invented during our generation. And there is an excitement to a new genre, which is what that was, you know, a new genre, whether it's a new genre of writing, a new genre of story that's being invented, or a new genre of music. I mean, that's exciting. That's bringing something into creation that wasn't there before. And there was an energy and an excitement about that apparently is pan-generational, that everybody feels it when they hear the music, which is kind of nice.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I talk to and I hear from people, either listeners of the show or people I meet if I am at a book signing or a book reading or anything of a book of my own. And they tell me about the story that they've got locked away inside of them. And they say, "Oh, I would love to write a book. I've got this story." And I try as much as possible to have guests on the show who can give some inspiration, give a little maybe kick, a little courage to those folks who do have a story inside of them to, okay, let it spill out a little bit, just maybe a page at a time. Let it start spilling out. And when I first started asking the question, I said, okay, you've got all of this education. Sometimes that's what people think they need, and it's intimidating to them. They think, who am I to start putting words down on paper? I don't know what I'm doing. But you were in getting a lot of education, but you mentioned you took a step, which was going to that person who taught at the community college. You engage with them one-on-one, and that's something anyone could do, even if it's not an instructor or professor at a college. It could be a writing group, and get someone who's published a novel to look at your stuff.
Well, there's also, I mean, I know there's the Editors Association of Canada. I'm sure there's the equivalent in you know, many of the states, where you can just hire by the hour an editor who has experience in the kind of writing that you want to do, who you can hire to give you feedback to do that. I would also add in, when you're talking about students that are telling you the same story, that they have a story locked inside of them, probably a story that's very much the story of their lives, because that's often where people start. There's a difference between wanting to be a writer and wanting to write a book. There is a difference between those two. And I think people being honest with themselves will come out with a happier conclusion. If you want to be a writer, that takes decades. You know, that takes so many hours sitting at a desk, fighting for that time, no matter what else you have to do in your life, that it is a huge commitment. And that's one road you can go down if it's that important to you that you're willing to make that kind of contribution to it. If it's a particular story you want to get out of yourself, and there's a book that you want to write, it's not that you want a whole career, you just want to get this story out, then that can give you the parameters of the project so that you can get somebody to help you do that. You can help somebody, well, first of all, you could have somebody ghostwrite it if you wanted to, where you tell somebody the story and they bring the technical expertise to putting the actual story together. or along a continuum. You can get any level of help you want with that. You could get somebody to do a chapter at a time, give you feedback on it, or you could do an outline, give it to that person and get feedback on it. The stories of disappointment often come when it's a mismatch between what you want and what you think you want. And I think that's where you have to be brutally honest with yourself about what you want to accomplish. Anything's accomplishable, but you can save yourself a lot of unnecessary angst if you are honest about what you want to do.
That's great advice. And I'm curious, would you ever consider writing a novel that took place in modern times?
Yes, actually, that is my next one. If I ever get a chance to write again, I have been learning how to be a marketer for the last couple of years. Yeah. Apparently, that's what you're supposed to do as a writer. So I spend much more of my time doing that than I do actually writing. But I know the next book I want to write, and it will be a contemporary book. And it's about a few years ago, I thought that my teaching was drying up. As it turned out, I was wrong. But during the short time that I got fewer courses than I thought I was going to get, I thought, I have to figure out what else to do. I have to diversify somehow. And so I went to a smaller city about an hour from here and bought what turned out to be 3 rental properties. And boy, there were stories that came out of those ones. So the working title is Landlording in the Hammer. What the challenge will be for me is to figure out how I have an overall arc of a story. I have a whole bunch of little anecdotes, as my details. And I don't yet know how to braid those together for one larger arc of a story. So this is going to be a technical challenge for me to do that, but that will be a contemporary story. And Fantastic. This year, I'm having a children's book come out, which is another different kind of book. My older son, when he was little, he was afraid of clowns. And so this was a little story I wrote for him to help teach him how to confront fear, is basically what it's about. It's called Beak the Clown, where you actually beak the nose on the clown. And when you confront your fears, they become less scary. And that's kind of the theme of it. So that will come out later this year as well.
I love it. That's great. I really appreciate you sharing all of this. I'm wondering if there's anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to talk about or promote. Right now I'm on your website, which is cindagault.com, and I see that we can get your books there and connect with you. Is there any other place that is good to connect with you?
Well, that's fine. You will all also be able to see Facebook and Instagram and all that kind of stuff there. But I would point out on the page, down at the bottom of that first page, in my studies, I learned about the history of genre. So that when people say, I love mystery, or I love romance, or I love historical fiction, we kind of take these genres for granted as though they've always been there, and we just pick what kind of book we want to write. But the story of how they were invented is quite a fascinating story itself. So I've done 10 little webinars. They're only about 10 minutes each. And it's free. All people need to do is leave me their email, and I will send it to you. But it tells the story of the last 700 or 800 years of how storytelling has developed and invented all the different genres and subgenres that we take for granted now. So I found it a fascinating story when I was learning about it. So I just wanted people to know about it, and they're welcome to just leave me your email address and I'll send these out to you.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really great. Well, thank you so much for that. I love jumping down little rabbit holes like that and learning new things and talking to my friends, and they look at me and they're like, when do you have time to learn this stuff? And
well, 10 minutes at a time, it's amazing what you can accomplish.
That's right. Well, Cinda, thank you so much for being here on A Joyful Rebellion today. And I look forward to hearing about your next project when it comes out.
Thank you. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thanks for joining me today. If something in this episode stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Screenshot it and tag me, or DM me on the socials, send smoke signals, whatever works. I want to know what you're plotting. This show isn't just about listening. It's about building something real together. So I hope to hear from you soon, and I'll be right here next week when you're ready to keep the rebellion going.